Robert G. Kaplan, if you wrote the Loom of Time right now, how would you have to rewrite it after Mr. Netanyahu's actions in Israel?
First of all, it's a pleasure to be with you, Tom. I would not have to rewrite it at all because Israel and Palestine are really not in the loom of time. And what I did do in the loom of time was I said that ultimately the Middle East will change dramatically with a change of regime in Iran that will be driven by internal factors, and that I think the events of October 7th, 2023, because of their very ferocity and bestiality and intimacy, have probably changed the Israeli calculation on Iran, that sometime in the future we're going to see direct Israeli attacks on Iran, not now because they have their hands full with Gaza.
Right.
And that Iran, as when Iran changes, when
Right.
85 million Iranians are brought into the global economy, that's when the Middle East will really shift.
James Stavridis was on yesterday, the former Supreme Commander NATO. He was fiery, incendiary about that we need to take actions against Iran. You're one of our experts on what we've gotten right, what we've gotten wrong about the cultural Sunni Shia debate, the idea that Iran has maybe the only legitimate middle class in the pan-Arab world. What is the Robert Kaplan prescription for how we approach Iran after 3 deaths in Jordan?
Well, first of all, keep in mind that the United States and especially Israel have been in an undeclared war with Iran for years now. And it really ramped up after October 7th and ramped up another degree or two after the 3 deaths at the U.S. military base in northeastern Jordan. I think the way they have to approach it is, everyone says, let's take out their nuclear facilities or their missile facilities. This is easier said than done. A lot of their nuclear facilities are deep underground. I don't think the Israelis have the equipment, the bunker buster bombs to do it. I think what the Biden administration has to do is increase by degrees it's retaliation. In other words, not tit for tat. And the reason why tit for tat doesn't work anymore is because the Iranian strategy is they will have their proxies attack Americans and Israelis, and the Americans and Israelis will then attack their proxies without hitting Iran directly. Therefore, Iran suffers no retribution. And because Iran is afraid of a dramatic retribution against them, because that could unhinge the domestic situation in Iran, which has been tense for years now.
Robert, is there political will in Washington, in the administration, in Congress for such a change maybe in posture towards Iran on the part of the U.S.?
Well, there might be in Congress. I'm not sure there is in the administration because, this is very unscientific, but this is an election year. And a wide-ranging war in the Middle East may not help the Biden administration, or would probably hurt it. So I think that, in our system, the commander-in-chief makes the calls. All the powerful experts can give him this advice and that, but he has to make the judgment call. And I think he's ultimately fixated on getting reelected and doesn't want a wide-ranging war with Iran. But, that being off the table, they have to really ramp up the level and ferocity of the attacks on Iranian proxies from Syria in the north to Yemen in the south.
Robert, what do you think the Israelis will do in the coming days, weeks, as it relates to their efforts in Gaza? I mean, the response was stronger probably than maybe a lot of people thought, but it's been certainly consistent with what they've said. They said they are going to wipe out Hamas, and a lot of people question whether that's even possible. What do they do from here, do you think?
All right. Well, the problem the Israelis have is if they have a permanent ceasefire that allows in massive amounts of rebuilding and humanitarian aid, the way that Gaza society is structured is that the remnants of Hamas will take that aid and re-strengthen themselves. Humanitarian aid is one thing, but rebuilding aid will be stolen by Hamas, and then the Israelis will not be back to square one, but they'll be back a number of steps. Therefore, I think the Israelis will do everything to keep putting off American pressure, saying nice things to Secretary of State Antony Blinken, but ultimately to keep pressing on and fighting. Yes, there might be a ceasefire for a few weeks to get back maybe 100 hostages, because Netanyahu is under a lot of domestic pressure to get more hostages released. But in the medium term and the long term, I think they keep bombing. Though it will shift from these sort of, I wouldn't call it indiscriminate, but these wide-ranging attacks on infrastructure in the Gaza Strip and change to intelligence-driven, targeted, attacks. We get intelligence that these people are in such and such a building, we bomb it. And they will keep doing that, and they will keep methodically going after the tunnels, flooding them with seawater, etc. The media loves novelty. And there isn't a lot of novelty after you accept that the Israelis are bombing and flooding the tunnels. It just takes time. It takes many weeks. So the media thinks Israel is not making progress, but that's false.
Robert Kaplan with us, folks. He will continue with us. Robert T. Kaplan, I can't say enough about his effort over the years. The Loom of Time was my book of the year. I just can't say enough about the span from Morocco to the stands off to the east. Of course, red and green in the screen here, the Dow up, everything else a little bit soft. Microsoft trading pretty much now where it was before. Robert Kaplan, I've got to go back because of the shock of our military at risk to the state of the Pacific. The jewel from years ago, Asia's cauldron, the South China Sea, and the end of a stable Pacific. We walked away from the Pacific Rim. Now we're coming back with 4 military bases sprawled across the Philippines, the debate of Taiwan. Give us an update on how you perceive the end of a stable Pacific.
All right. First of all, the Chinese love to constantly bully and push around the Philippines, because the Philippines is a weak state compared to the other major states in the Pacific, but it is also a treaty ally, the highest form of ally with the United States. So whenever China bullies around the Philippines, Beijing is also poking Washington in the eye. I think what we've seen is the creation of this wall of sand, where the Chinese have literally dumped sand, created atolls, built military bases in a very, in a very slow-moving fashion, in salami-sliced fashion, so that gradually over the last decade since I published Asia's Cauldron, the Chinese have essentially taken over the South China Sea without the United States being able to do much. It's been, they've done it by 1,000 cuts, and each one so small that for us to retaliate, we would seem to be over-retaliating.
I'm going to cut in here because I know Paul wants to jump in. One final question on that. If it's been by 1,000 cuts, what are there 1,000 cuts as it relates to Taiwan?
Remember, the Taiwan is the northern border of the South China Sea. It is the cork in the bottle of the South China Sea. So by taking over the South China Sea, China makes tremendous progress in enveloping and making an end run around Taiwanese sovereignty.
Robert, we've seen economic data coming out of China much weaker than maybe people would have expected with the reopening of that economy. How does that change maybe the calculus of President Xi as he thinks about the positioning of China in that part of the world, also vis-a-vis the U.S.?
Yeah, when you have a big authoritarian state that is economically weaker but militarily stronger and becoming stronger and stronger, like China, that's a very dangerous situation because the regime can always be tempted to kind of distract its population with nationalist posturing, especially if that population isn't producing enough, if that economy is not producing enough jobs, especially for young males, etc. So I think like an economically fragile China going forward, even as China is producing more nuclear weapons, more warships, more nuclear-powered submarines, the most important thing of all. I think it's a very tense situation. The combination of those two factors.
Yep, and I guess from the technology standpoint, it really feels like there's a technology Cold War between China and the West. What do you think the U.S. posture should be politically, policy-wise, towards China over the next several years?
Look, we have to avoid at all costs a major hot war in the Pacific. The markets around the world have absorbed in very well 25 years of warfare in the Middle East. They've absorbed warfare in Ukraine. They've made adjustments. They've priced it in. But a hot, high-end war in the Pacific would be like COVID-19. It would be like an extinction level event for a period of time for markets. It would disrupt supply chains in a big way and all of that. So how do you avoid a hot war? Well, you get to what I call a post-Cuban Missile Crisis situation. The Cuban Missile Crisis, both superpowers stared into the abyss and they were absolutely terrified. And afterwards, you got the hotline established, nuclear arms limitation talks, nuclear test ban treaty, ultimately détente. That's what we have to get to with China without having a Cuban Missile Crisis.
Dr. Kaplan, I'm running out of time. Robert T. Kaplan, as simple as I can make it. Do we have a foreign policy now? After the tumult of the last X number of years of presidential politics, all that's going on in Washington, whatever anybody's political affiliation, do you see a foreign policy in this nation?
I do, but I see it in danger of changing by 180 degrees every 4 years. We don't have the continuity of a foreign policy the way we used to have.